All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening. Welcome to today's webinar on game-based learning with featured presenter Jim Higman. Hi, I'm Shyam Sundar, co-founder and chief learning architect of Greenbooks. I would like to thank all of you for taking time and joining this webinar, and a special thanks to Jim Higman, who is dialing in from San Diego, California, and this is 4 a.m. Thank you so much, Jim, for joining us, and hoping to have a great session with you and with the rest of the participants.
You're most welcome, John.
So, how can you participate in this webinar? One, you can respond to a poll, and that's our way of engaging you. On a time-to-time basis, we will ask you questions and see how you respond to it, and your insights, we will use it back in the session. Two, you can ask questions throughout the session, and we will capture these questions and try and answer as much as possible. If you're an avid tweeter, so please do tweet with hashtag #GameLearn, and we would love to see what your tweets and your insights are. Okay, some basic housekeeping questions. Will I get PPT? Will I have access to this webinar later? Yes. That's the answer for both the questions. We will share this PPT and the webinar, and you can in turn revisit the presentation and rehear this webinar as well. Okay, what's in for the store? Today we have a full-packed agenda. Agenda 1 is to see the role of a game-based learning in enhancing learning outcomes. 2 is see a real-life example of a successful game-based learning modules that we have in the store. And 3, how do we see an ROI of a game-based learning? And finally, we will take your questions. Quick poll. What is your organization's status on learning gamification? You have 4 choices. You're just learning, or you're planning to implement in the next 3 to 6 months, or you already started implementing in a small way, or already implementing a full-fledged system. We will take about a few seconds to gather responses. So the responses are pouring in. Wow. Okay. Interestingly, 70% of the people are just learning, and around 20% of the people are planning to implement in the next 3 to 6 months. And some of them, about 10%, are already implementing or implementing in a full-fledged way. That's pretty shocking. Thank you so much for the poll. Okay, so let's see a small story. Meet Prasad, who is the L&D manager of a large IT firm who works here. Now, Prasad is responsible for talent development, and his global workforce is spread, and to develop them, he uses classroom training and traditional e-learning as well. So with all the existing methods, Prasad was able to train a large number of people, and he was able to meet his employees' training mandates, and he was able to standardize his content, which is a good thing. So Prasad is a happy man. He did great. He's doing very good. Until his boss, big boss rather, came and questioned him on a few areas. He asked, what is the innovative thing that we're doing in the learning and development? And how much of the learners are engaged with the content to embrace it? What is the motivation and confidence to apply the learning on the job? And what kind of a business impact are we getting from the training that we're investing, and what is the ROI? These questions made Prasad very uncomfortable. What he thought he was doing great, suddenly these questions popped up to him, and he wasn't sure what he's doing. So a quick poll right now. So what should Prasad do? Believe his efforts will pay off eventually, or ignore his boss, or investigate for insights? Okay, I think that's an unanimous response, investigate for insights. Great. So Prasad's going to investigate for insights. Now, as a part of it, he decides to do a focus group with few participants. And particularly, he spoke to one particular person called Priya, and also known as Miss Performer. Priya, she says, the content right now leads to poor engagement and there's no interactivity. Why so? Because this is how the e-learning programs look like. It's boring, no interactivity, pictures are not clear, no connection, no challenges, nothing at all. And if the goal is only to move forward the slides and you know what will be the outcome, people are just interested in completing it. And that's exactly what happens with the e-learning that they have. Moving on. And Priya says when she's engaged, she's more productive and she's willing to dedicate more time and effort to learn new things. And she's willing to try out new things. But when she's not engaged, she says she's less productive, kills time, and distracted. So that also led to not attaining of skill proficiency. Now, specifically for skill-based programs, what Priya wants is more of the white box, which is the skill practice, and less of the gray box, which is the knowledge absorption in the training flow. That's what she wants. But what she gets is more of the gray box, which is the knowledge absorption, and less of the white box, which is the skill practice. Now, because she doesn't have enough opportunity to practice, that has led to a poor retention as well. Now, because of the audio visuals and reading and lectures doesn't help her retain the information after she gets back to work like an advanced simulator does. Hence, it was very difficult for Priya to take the leap from the classroom to the workplace about the learned skills. So this kind of gave a lot of insights to Prasad. And he is thinking, okay, if my learners are engaged, they're likely to learn and practice. If they learn and practice, they're likely to apply skills on the job. If they apply skills on the job, they're likely to create a business impact and therefore will eventually lead to an ROI. Now he has some direction. He has 3 challenges to do. 1, increase learning engagement. How do you need to improve skill proficiency and enhance retention? So, with all that challenges in mind, Prasad started questioning his existing instructional design models. Is it working? Why is it not working? What should I do to enhance or bring in more engagement? Introducing the gamification of education. A quick poll before we go there. Which of the following makes learning more engaging? Learners apply skills in realistic controlled environment, or gamifying systems with no changes to content, or a mix of both? Interesting results. Okay, so we have about 90% said mix of both, absolutely right. And we have about 8% said learners apply skills in realistic controlled environment. And some of them have voted for the second option, gamifying systems with no changes to the content. Awesome. So let's call in Jim to see how his insights can help Prasad to navigate some of his challenges.
Thank you, Shyam. If you go to the slide, there we go. One of the wonderful things about working at a company like GameLearn is there's lots of hype involved. So it means that people pay attention to you. And here's a good example of the hype. Gartner says that in just a few years, next year, 40% of global companies will use gamification. Also, they predict that 80% of current gamified applications will actually fail to meet. So this is a good illustration that there's a lot of hype there, and then where there's a lot of hype, there'll obviously be instances where there's failure. Some of this hype actually is, from our perspective, confusing, because what happens is people will tend to mix up different definitions. So what I thought I would do is walk you quickly through and to give you a better understanding of both gamification as well as what we do, game-based learning. So one of the things that happens out there, and people are very familiar with this, is simulations, where you essentially go into a controlled environment and you learn by essentially simulating reality. And there's lots of instances of that. But what we do is very different. What we do essentially is we take a couple of different things. We take gamification, and I'll explain a little more detail what that is, plus simulation, and we create games where people play to actually learn. So gamification, examples of that basically to use any kind of game mechanic to inspire employees to be engaged in the learning process. So example of a game mechanic would be a badge, would be a prize, would be a leaderboard. These things are quite common. So that's gamification. As I said earlier, simulation is essentially putting someone into a virtual world so that they experience reality but doing it in a controlled environment. So again, as I said earlier, what we do is gamification plus simulation. If you go to the next slide, there we go. Within gamification, there are actually two sort of types of gamification, and I'll explain both of them. And then when I talk about our games, I'll make a specific reference to them. The first type is structural. And this is, as I said earlier, it's really essentially, it's quite a simple thing. It's use of game elements to get an achieved outcome. In the context of learning, it's to get a learner to complete a course or to do something. I think, if you go to the next slide, I think a lot of you are familiar of instances of this used. For example, lots of LMS systems will use gamification features to ensure that people get course completion. So, for example, they'll get points. They will have sort of badges for having done a series of courses and things like that. And this gamification is done not just in the learning context, but it's done in all different sorts of contexts. So, for example, Salesforce has gamification features to it, and it's quite a common thing to find out there. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of buzz around this. So people pretty simply slap a badge on. They put a leaderboard together with the assumption that it's going to change behavior, and it's quite effective. One of the things, if you think about this, is to sort of step back a little bit and to sort of go back to early sort of behavior. How do we get people to, children for example, to do things? And one of the things we do is we reward them. So all this is really doing is to basically drive off basic human impulse to have reward and recognition. So that's essentially one type of gamification. Content gamification, which is more complex, is to really take something and to wrap it in a game. And in this case, what you do is you present challenges. You present a story, a narrative, characters. You have people engaged in missions. And the thought here is essentially is to take someone and put them in a second environment, a very different environment, so that they are less focused on what is happening in front of them in terms of the learning, but they are focused on the game elements. But by doing so, what you do is you actively engage the learner so that they are really engaged, compelled, and they really are motivated to complete that. So examples of that, as I said earlier, are stories, challenges. One important thing that happens in a game-based environment is that you have feedback. You have the opportunity within that environment to have the players understand what they are doing well, understand what they are not doing well as to get feedback on that, as well as the opportunity to do that again. Perhaps the best use of games and the most important use of games in terms of what happens is to think about it as a safe environment where you are not penalized for failing. It's not in a classroom where somebody is concerned about making a mistake and having his peers or colleagues reflect on that. It's an environment where you can really immerse yourself, make a mistake, the only feedback is from the computer. The hardest thing about doing game-based learning, and one of the reasons there are very little examples of it, is it's an incredibly difficult thing to do because there is a great balance between challenge and sort of not making it too difficult. What you want to do is you want to figure an optimal balance between adequate challenge so that the learner is motivated, is pushed to change his or her behavior, to add, to do things differently, but at the same time not to discourage the learner too much. The adequate balance between challenge and motivation leads to this increased skill. So how this is done is through tasks that are actually achievable, by setting clear goals, by making the learner the author of his or her destiny so that he or she makes decisions, is able to solve problems, but to also use all the elements of a game that we all remember so well from doing it as children: surprise, complexity, novelty, fantasy. All these things are very sort of wonderful mechanics to engage the brain and to get them to learn. So as illustrated here on this slide, there is a sort of fine line between the two where you get sort of optimal learning. Do you want to do this poll, Shyam, or would you prefer me to go through this one?
So let's host it right now. The poll is on your screen in a few seconds.
So the poll is, as everyone sees, what type of learning method drives retention better?
So the response is 100% said studying a little bit content at a time is very effective. Okay, that's right. Indeed, what we have seen is when you really space the learning out and using repeated practice, these are two powerful ID concepts can significantly increase the impact of your brain. In other words, in a spaced repetition, short bursts of learning delivered over recurring intervals are far more effective than massed learning given through a learner. The second learning concept is in a retrieval practice, when a learner answers knowledge and scenario or situational review questions, it has a tremendous impact on the long-term retention and accelerated application as well. Okay, all these sounds great, but some of the questions that comes to us.
So, and these are questions we get as a company when we're out talking to people about our solutions. And the first one is really, does this really apply to adults? There's a lot of skepticism about that. The second question is, does gender matter? There's a perception that games, in particular video games, are very much a male occupation. Then we get questions about sort of what's out there in the future, what's going to happen next. And then the most important question we get is really sort of what happens when people play games? What's the impact of your games? So let me walk you through some statistics here that I think will probably impress you. The first one, if you go to the slide above, Shyam, the average age of a gamer is 34. It's older than the perception, and obviously every day it's a little bit older. The average, in terms of gender, 43%, I believe, is the number of games are women. Gamers are women. So that's an important statistic there. We're not talking about sort of just a young person's thing. This is really sort of a prevalent behavior. And I think if you turn to the slide on a couple of slides down, Shyam, there's a slide on sort of millennials. There we go. I think one of the best ways to sort of take a look at this as an option in terms of learning is to really consider what is your workforce now and how has it changed from, say, 5, 10, 15 years ago. At present, it's about 30% Gen Y and millennial. But this is really at the point where there's going to be a point of inflection where the change will happen dramatically, where a large part of it, in just a short time, will be millennial. And millennial in this context means people who were born between 1980 and 2000, more or less. And this generation is really the video game generation, where I said earlier that the average age of the video game player is 34. In this generation, 90% plus play video games, and this is true globally, and I'm sure it's true in the case in India. One of my favorite statistics on this is that by the average age of 18, and this is not in the slides, the average 18-year-old in the U.S. has played about 10,000 hours of video games, which is exactly the same amount of time as he or she would have spent in middle school and high school. So when you think about the amount of formal classroom learning is the equivalent of the amount of time that they spent playing video games, you get a sense of kind of the importance of video games within that generation. Here's some statistics on India I see in terms of gameplay, where it occurs. So you get a real sense that this is a very important shift, a very important trend. I think perhaps as probably people know, video games are actually outsell movies in terms of customer spend. So let's transition it then. If you go to the next slide, Cheyenne, the one with the kind of the brain, to games and what they do for learning. There's a lot of neurological science out there about games, and one of the things they find is that it's a wonderfully powerful way of engaging the brain and increasing learning. And if you kind of stop and pause about this and put aside video games, it's not a particularly surprising thing, because if you consider age-old examples, chess, played to learn military strategy, polo, played to learn to be a cavalry, and people, I'm sure, can think of their own examples. In terms of HR and training and development, there are a few vivid examples. They tend to be custom-made games, and one is highlighted here. NTT, a Japanese company, put together a leadership game that had wonderful success in terms of its ability to change behavior and impact development of leaders. You'll see some other statistics up here. All these are based on complex neurological studies, which find essentially that by engaging in games, including playing video games, that the brain actually alters and synapses or new synapses are developed, and the brain sort of it changes so that the learned behavior is instilled. Next slide, please. So what we did at GameLearn is we kind of took a look at sort of there's this great opportunity out there where there's a generation that grew up playing video games. And what we wanted to do is to see that if we could capture that interest and do it through an effective game-based learning. And I'll walk you through kind of in a bit our games and how they work. But if you flip to 2 slides down, Cheyenne. There we go. This is a kind of a complex graphic, obviously. But here what we've done is sort of, and Cheyenne mentioned he'll pass you this PPT if you want, but this is really a good place to focus because it takes sort of side-by-side solutions people look at in the market, classroom training, traditional e-learning, and what we do. And I would sort of say that we really are a third option. And you can see here, and I won't go through it in great detail, that we present a very positive, powerful option. We sort of sit in between. We have the advantages of classroom learning in terms of the ability to impact learning. We have the advantages of traditional e-learning in terms of the ability to do it across geographies and scale. And as I said earlier, so there are some unique game-based things that that present themselves particularly well. The ability to practice, the ability to fail, the ability to experience there. So this is a kind of a complex but good illustration of how things, the advantage that is brought by game-based learning. If you turn to the next slide there, Sean. As I said earlier, designing learning games is a very difficult thing to do. If you think of it as sort of 3 Venn diagrams, what you're doing on the one hand is you want to present a fun game, so that's a particular skill. The second thing is you want to present a subject matter, so you have to be a content expert. And the third thing you have to do is to be able to teach in that environment. So it's an intersection of those 3 Venn diagrams, the content, the video game, as well as the teaching. And to do that, you really have to sort of hit a whole bunch of buttons. And these are kind of the most important things. They have to be engaging, full of content, as I said earlier, safe places to risk take. You have to motivate the players throughout the game. Our games, I should mention, are about 10 hours playing time. You don't do it in one shot. It's though some people do stay up all night doing it. It's a kind of a non-continuous thing for the most part. And you continuously, throughout that game, you present problem solving so that people learn, pick up a new solution, a new skill, and change their behavior accordingly. As Shyam earlier said, optimal training is focused around sort of flow states so that the learner learns something, has the opportunity to then put it into practice, develop it, and then come back and learn something new. And our games are built that way so that there are natural breaks, lessons learned, takeaways, things of that nature. So let me give you kind of a little specific detail about our games and specifically what they are. As a kind of a high level, we are a global company. We operate pretty much in every continent. India is a new market for us, and we're doing that through Greenbooks. And we've got, at this point, close to 400 clients. we've got two games in the market. The first game is called Triskelion. And in this game, which is, as I said earlier, about a 10-hour playing experience, you become a history professor. And you solve a series of mysteries as you live in a kind of a virtual 21-day world. And you, during the course of that, you handle your email. You go to meetings. You respond to calls. You do different sorts of work. You live in this sort of virtual environment which forces you to learn and to develop proper time management skills. In this virtual environment, you even attend to your personal life. You eat, you go to the dry cleaners, you go to the gym. So our first game is Triskelion, which is built around learning a time management skills. Our second game is Merchants, which is played to learn to negotiate. And in Merchants, you become a 15th century Venetian merchant, and you build your merchant empire. So you meet famous historical figures like Leonardo da Vinci, Machiavelli, and you go through a series of cases which teach you how to negotiate. It's really kind of a wonderfully complex game. As the screen says here, there are 6 negotiations. So in one of the negotiations, you'll negotiate with a merchant about taking his commodities around the world. In another negotiation, you will negotiate to get a loan. And some of the negotiations are not even commercial. You'll negotiate to prevent a war. So it's built on sort of a Harvard case study methodology where you learn the facts of a case and then you apply them through this game-based environment. If you go to the next slide, please. Throughout all our games, and what you're seeing here is a screenshot from Merchants, we incorporate some of the gamification elements I talked about. So there are leaderboards. So what this means in terms of our clients is they will have their employees all participate and, in this case, negotiate so that they are able then to see who is doing well relative to each other. And there's a nice feature in this game where as you develop wealth, your house grows in size. It's a nice visual representation of that, so that each of the employees, and usually we have 50, 100, in some cases 1,000 employees playing, each of them has the opportunity then to see how their colleagues are doing and to get a little bit of envy or competition instilled, because it's a great learning motivator. So this is a screenshot of our leaderboard. Characters, as I mentioned earlier, one of the great gamification features that we use in our games is to have compelling characters, and the player themselves actually becomes a character, and that's a very important part of game-based learning, because by doing so, the person sort of has the ability to separate himself or herself from reality, and that's a powerful, this artificial reality is a powerful way of freeing up the ability to learn. So you have the presence of compelling characters is very important. In both our games, we use a kind of a mentor as the representative of educating, conveying the learning concepts. So in Merchants, there's this kind of wizened old mentor who the player throughout the game touches back with, and through the mentor learns different lessons. So they learn kind of basic principles of how to negotiate through the mentor. So rather than kind of just reading something or or watching, as you would in e-learning, a PowerPoint. In this instance, what they do is there's the actual sense of engagement with a character who conveys these lessons. Next slide, please. As I said earlier, one of the wonderful features about a game-based learning environment is it's personalized. So my experience playing the game is very different from the experience of anybody else. And there's almost an infinite set of different outcomes through the game. It's really a very complex environment, and people can travel around freely. But based on each person's input, because it is a computer-based program, the computer then looks to a database, underlying database, and generates personalized feedback. This is a wonderful advantage of game-based learning because unlike, for example, in a classroom environment where there is, of course, the opportunity for personalized feedback, given the size of the group and the sort of one trainer, multiple learners, it doesn't happen as often as it should. In a game, because it really is a game-to-player environment, the ability to draw on a database, say you did this well, you perhaps should have done this differently, is a powerful advantage. Next slide, please. This is a screenshot of merchants, and it gives an example of gamification, use of a kind of a structural gamification technique where everybody is incented to complete the game. Again, this is a 10-hour game, so it's not a short exercise. In this instance, what people do is they build up their merchant fleet. So people really want to have a lot of ships, and in this instance, you can see kind of the trade routes that this particular player has done. It's gone to Lebanon, to Aleppo, to Beirut, and you can see kind of what this particular player has done in this case. You can see on the side there's it's a little hard to read, where you can see the wealth that tracks the amount of wealth that the player has generated through this game through his trading efforts. That wealth is an example of a gamification tool to encourage learning, since it obviously motivates the person to increase their wealth, hence they go through the game, learn the lessons and things like that. The hardest thing that we do, and probably the most distinguishing thing that we do relative to other games in the market, is our environment is incredibly complex, so that when people are playing our games, they do things from scratch. It is not a kind of a basic decision tree environment where, for example, you ask a player to choose A, B, or C, and depending on how they do that, it takes them to a different part of the environment. Rather, what we do, drawing on this extensive database, is we have, and this is in the case of merchants, we have the negotiator actually from scratch design his or her proposals to solve the particular case. And through the game, as I said earlier, there are 6 cases. As you go through the game and you get to the later cases, it gets increasingly complex, so that by the last negotiation, the 6th negotiation, there are as many as 14 different variables, all of which the player can choose, mix or choose from, and craft his or her own particular solution, which again then based on sort of the underlying database rules, the computer says you could have done this, suggests you should have done that. So this is a very distinguishing feature in terms of our games, the ability to play and develop solutions from scratch rather than sort of simple multiple choice decision tree basis. So this all sounds wonderful. I'm sure it all sounds highly complex. It's one of these things that's difficult to describe, best to actually experience. But here's some kind of feedback on what we've experienced. We've done it for now 30,000 plus. It's actually closer to 40,400 companies at this stage, and it's kind of a who's who of companies. The most important statistic here, I think, is the completion one. 90% of people who play our games 12 hours complete them. And we encourage them as they play through this. We have people who get in touch with them and say, are you stuck? Could you use a little hint here or something like that? But it's a phenomenal statistic when you think about it. And if you benchmark it, for example, against conventional e-learning, sort of PPT or video-based, I'm sure as people on the webinar know, it really stands out. Of those 90% who complete them, 99% recommend it. Very importantly, they find that it has practical application to their job. So the players who do our negotiation game report back that they're able to use the skills they learn. The players who play our time management then are able to report back that they are able to use the time management skills. And obviously people are quite satisfied with what we do. Let me give you kind of a specific example. You turn to the next slide. One of our clients is a company called Savvis, and actually they changed their name pretty recently to CenturyLink. And what they wanted to do, and this is kind of a fairly typical thing, is they wanted to have their sales force play our game. So in particular, our merchants game. It's a natural thing to think about because Salesforce, obviously, on a day-to-day basis is involved in negotiation. Though I will stress that we find that in the case of merchants that we're able to successfully help not just salespeople, but anybody who deals with contract, HR, kind of pretty much everybody who has anything to do with making agreements or within an organization. So Savvis had their sales force take a look at our games, and they played it, and they did it through kind of a very systematic process where they benchmarked those who did it and those who didn't play our games, and they found that this portion of the sales force that did it reported back the following favorable metrics: that they had increased confidence in their selling skills. They were actually able to shorten their sales cycles. And this shouldn't be controversial in the sense that the people who did this came out of this really with enhanced negotiation skills. They were able to, because of those enhanced negotiation skills, increase revenue per transaction. And essentially what they were able to do is really to take their sales force and to improve their particular negotiation skills, and to do this through a game-based, video game-based environment that really resonated with their employee workforces. So overall, it was a wonderful win for them, a wonderful win for us, and it's just one example of any number of them that we've done with different clients. I think that probably covers what I wanted to cover, and I think given time constraints, maybe, Sean, we should go to Q&A at this point.
Absolutely. I think that was fantastic insights, Jim. I think now Prasad will have a solid solution to go about a method of approaching his learning methods. Okay, so we will take the Q&A, whatever questions that comes in, and Jim will be happy to answer. Okay, so one of the questions that we have, Jim, is somebody asks if they have to customize this for them, what is the go-to?
It's a great question. We get a lot of requests for that because, well, obviously when we go in to talk to customers, they're kind of, wow, I've never seen anything like this, and one of their first places they go to see that is to, can we customize this? We really built it so that it is an off-the-shelf solution, and that's kind of our business model. And to make one of our games is close to about a $2 million investment. It takes a period of time. So unless somebody is kind of interested in that high math, which is probably not the case, it's probably something that wouldn't really fall within our ambit. If somebody's looking to have something customized, I'm happy to put them in touch with. There are some companies that do this. They don't do it as well as we do, but they do have custom build models. That's their business model.
Okay, so for some of them who wanted to ask questions, there is a control panel on the right. If you could click the orange button, the control panel will expand, and there you can key in your questions. Jim, there's another question which has come saying that if they would have to, is it a cloud-based application or will they have to host it in their systems?
Great question. It's a cloud-based. The only technical requirement is it's a built-in Adobe Flash, so to have Adobe on the system, but it's accessed through our own online, through our own hosting. It's built in Flash. Our future games, I will mention, will be, to anticipate a question, will be built in HTML5. So that will remove the need for the Flash-based, but for current purposes, it's Flash-based, and all you need is internet access.
Okay, I think Jim will take one more question. So if you could talk about what are the future games that's on the pipeline, it'll be great.
Sure. The next game, which we are kind of in the process of working on, is a leadership game. We will take kind of a lot of the lessons we've learned from our existing games and apply them for that next game. But it'll be a game where people will get put in this adventure environment and develop leadership skills. In terms of looking at the development map afterwards, it's kind of, not surprisingly, exactly what you would expect from a company focused on sort of soft skill based development. We'll be looking at doing games that are help with specifically with sales ability, influence. We'll be looking at games on sort of persuasive communication. We will also be looking to do games that are kind of today's challenges games, if you will, in terms of developing a global mindset, for example. How to make employees so that they're globally suited for what is increasingly a world that requires people to deal with people from other cultures and things like that. So that's a kind of a little insight. Next one up, leadership, and then beyond that, sales and a few other soft skills focused ones.
So there's another question from Kush Bhargava, and his question, Jim, is, are these simulations used with assessment centers, and what is the feedback?
That's a really wonderful question. I think we're a youngish company, so what we've done to date is one thing incredibly well. We've built a game-based solution that nobody else has done in the market. And one of the things we're looking to do then is to enhance that, that capacity. So at present, we are talking to a number of sort of market leaders in the assessment area about how to take both our existing games, and particularly with an eye towards our next game, to use it as not just a vehicle for teaching, for training, but also for a vehicle to assess employee capabilities and use that as a kind of a benchmarking tool. So at present, with the little caveat, and I'll get to that caveat in a moment, it isn't formally set up to do that. We're looking to do that. The caveat on it is that there's a whole series of feedback, as I said, that gets involved in our game. So each player who plays our game gets specific feedback. You do this well, you don't do that well. All that feedback, and I should add, all the scoreboards, all the sort of who's played, how far they played, all of that is available to the L&D or the HR client. So in that sense, the client gets tons of feedback about what his or her employees do well and what their grounds for improvement.
So I think we partly answered the question, Jim, but Sugat has a question.
Sure.
The question is, do you depend on LMS for reporting the stats, or you have your own API?
We can integrate it pretty much with any LMS. We have our own API, and we do it through a series of integrations. There's kind of from complex to quite simple. But it is, for those who are kind of very familiar with e-learning and stuff, our games are not SCORM compliant, and the reason for that is it's not a linear world. It's not a world where you start and then you go forward, you can't go backwards. Our worlds are really ones where you can go at will throughout the environment. So it doesn't lend itself to sort of SCORM tracking, but what we do have is our own API, which we make available through integration or otherwise through a client's LMS that tracks player progress, tracks the scoreboard, and we've done this with pretty much every LMS system out there in the market.
So we will take last two more questions, Jim, and one question that's come up is, will you keep upgrading your existing games? That's by Satyanarayan. If yes, what time duration?
We do, and we make it a constant process. So our time management game, the version that's in the market now is kind of, I think, either 3.0 or 4.0. And we spent an extensive period of time earlier this year improving it, adding additional functionality. I'll give a specific example. One of the things when you play Triskelion, the time management game, you have a series of tasks that you are required to complete by deadlines, much as you do in the real world. And you are graded on your ability to meet those deadlines, to juggle different priorities. One of the functionalities we added to Triskelion earlier was, just recently, was to give the ability to decline tasks. It sounds like a kind of a simple thing, but again, it's an example of us taking the real world and applying it in our games, because sometimes when people ask you to do things, the best answer is, I'm sorry, I'm too busy, I cannot do everything else. And then you use a series of rules to assess if that was done well. Obviously, you don't want to say no to the big project from your boss. You can say no to sort of ancillary things. So yes, we updated. We just updated Triskelion to add a lot of new functionality. We will be updating merchants later this year to do similarly.
Brilliant. So we will take one last question, Jim, and then we will wind up. So there's one question which has come up from Moser Bear. This is from Kamal. He's saying, will these games help in a manufacturing setup to help their workforce development?
I do, and our clients range across industries. I mean, we have pharma clients, we have automotive clients. I think Chime can provide you with one of our kind of a client list and stuff. It ranges across, and what we find from clients, and particularly in the industrial complex, is obviously time management is a skill that applies throughout the organization, but also negotiation, because a lot of people really spend time kind of trying to, for example, figure out what task is going to be worked on. That's a negotiation. So it applies in an industrial context, it applies throughout all contexts. But here's a really important insight. And this kind of allows us to go beyond kind of content specific. There's a lot of training out there. There's a lot of face-to-face training. There's a lot of e-learning. My own view on e-learning is pretty negative, and I don't think that's a controversial position. I don't think it's done well. So what we offer people who are running L&D and HR and stuff is the opportunity to give their employees a really fun and impactful learning experience. And that has a kind of a tangential value that's very powerful. So when we talk to clients, we often find them saying, well, you know, I may not specifically need time management. I may not specifically have put in the slot that I need to do some negotiation training, but I see the value of providing this to my employees from kind of a positive, show them I'm paying attention, show them I see how they're learning type perspective. So in that specific context, in an industrial or wherever else, it makes a lot of sense.
So Jim, we'll take one final question, or rather we will club two questions. This is one from Satya. And how do you differentiate your games for different levels of employees? For example, engineer versus managers versus DGMs. And another question from Saiba is, can we also position this game as a tool to assess employee skills? So if you can answer this, we will wind up.
I missed the last part. I saw the first one across levels, but the second one was?
It says, can we use these games to use as an assess employee skills?
Okay. On the first one, I'll give you kind of the company answer, and then I'll give you kind of the honest answer.
Sure.
The company answer is that our games can be kind of change, teach, and impact behavior across an organization. So we've got CEOs who have played our games and learned something from it. We've had lower level people who have played our games and learned something from it. But it is a bell curve. And for the most part, it is kind of your sort of manager up to sort of a quite high-level executive. Those are the people who are going to be most impacted from it. The reason it is a broad bell curve is because of the personalized nature of it. Your experience will be very different from anybody else's. And if you are really skilled at this, it will allow you to touch levels of the game that would not be touched by somebody less skilled about it. So it is a wide bell curve, but obviously it is for the most part sort of centered around a middle level. So that's the first part. The second part, in terms of assessing, yes, in the specific sense that the players get feedback on their particular performance. So let me give a specific example since it may help. In merchants, one of the key metrics that gets tracked is the ability to develop trust, to have the other negotiator, because essentially what you do in merchants is you negotiate against a different series of negotiators, but to build trust in that other sort of counterparty. And the way you do that is classically in negotiation is you pay attention, you listen to them, you understand their interests, you follow what they want to have happen. And as you do that successfully in the game, your trust bar will improve. If you don't do that, your trust bar will go down. So that kind of feedback, to go back to the Savage CenturyLink thing, was a very important feedback. So they were able to see each of their sales force and see who did a good job of this, or those who didn't, those who were kind of pushy salespeople, who were kind of not listening to what the client wanted to have happen and stuff. So that's a specific example of how the game does provide feedback on player skills, abilities, and stuff. And as I said earlier, we will increasingly formalize that and perhaps do that through a partnership with a company who's kind of experts on doing that. Does that answer those questions?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jim, for taking time and waking early in the morning and giving us great insights and fantastic answers. So thank you all the participants. Like I said, we are recording this webinar and we will share this in a few days' time. So thanks very much and have a great day or a great evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.